Okay, guys, we're going to get started. Thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So first off, I'll introduce myself. My name's Natalie. I'm our Director of Marketing here at MedStack. Also from MedStack on this morning's call is our CEO and co-founder Balaji Gopalan, as well as Joe Audi, who is one of our engineers. You'll be hearing from both of them in a little bit.
This is Balaji Gopalan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of MedStack. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what we do and why we do it as a preamble to the product demo you're going to see today. This is something we've been working on for quite some time based on a lot of feedback from our valued customers over the past few years. And so, the problem we're trying to solve, if you're new to us, is that digital health innovation often runs into a barrier at adoption because the privacy and security expectations of data of the healthcare industry are so stringent that many people building solutions don't pass the audits at the hospitals, insurance companies, and clinic networks that they're selling to. And we've proven this by way of helping our customers with customer audits that they've gone through as they've been selling their solutions. And we've done this with a number of hospitals and insurance companies over the past few years. So what we're actually providing is infrastructure. So every one of our customers gets a single tenant virtual private cloud that's flexible and tailored for their application requirements. We run that infrastructure as an operations team for things like security patches, performance, and helping with scalability and architectural planning. We tie these to pre-written code-generated policies. And the reason they're code-generated is because then we can use our infrastructure to prove that they're actually in place in real time. This is what we call active compliance. We've built this based on industry standard compliance frameworks that the industry is actually following. And then, of course, we support our customers as they sell in to the healthcare industry. We've been doing this for a bunch of years, and we're based in Ontario, Canada, but we've basically been covering this in a number of jurisdictions, primarily North America, but even beyond as well. So who are we doing this with? Well, some of our customers are actually on the line today, which we're really, really honored and thankful for. We've got over 60 companies on the platform today doing all sorts of things in digital health. Really, anywhere where there's patient data in the cloud, we can help. So our customers are building telemedicine, chronic condition monitoring and management, data management for medical research, the software cloud application aspect of connected medical devices. And then we have a bunch of customers who are working in the logistics area of healthcare for things like continuity of care, especially for long-term care, healthcare billing, healthcare scheduling, and the operations of the healthcare industry itself. So that's a really quick introduction of who we are and what we do. The reason we're here today is because we found that our compliance story, while it's beneficial to what our customers are doing and helping them scale their businesses, as they've become successful, they've come back to us and said, we need more power and flexibility with the way that we manage our infrastructure based on the technical requirements of our application. We're scaling. We're iterating our technology product rapidly, and the way that our engagement model used to work was that we were actively managing the infrastructure and all the settings and configuration of the infrastructure. What you'll see today that Joe is going to present to you is a new way of working with MedStack that increases the power, flexibility, and responsiveness of that whole system. If you'd like to meet us and talk to us more about it in person, we're doing a bit of a rockstar tour the latter part of this year, and we're really excited about showcasing MedStack Control in all these different environments where people are passionate about digital health entrepreneurship. So here are some of the places that we'll be in the next few months, and of course there's more things coming up. And not to give too much away, but there'll be a couple of announcements at some of these events as well. So this is definitely not the most fun part of it today, so I want to end it here, and I'm sure you guys are very eager to see what MedStack Control actually looks like. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe now to take over and walk us through the demo. I guess just as a preamble to that, I want to just explain a little bit more about what our compliance framework is because it's actually common between our current product and our current offering that these 60 customers are using and what is behind MedStack Control as well. So essentially the way that our compliance framework works is that we've built all our policies mapped to ISO 27001. This is a global standard that's very well documented and very well organized, but also maps very nicely to the healthcare specific regulatory expectations in various different jurisdictions. So we started with that as a framework. And essentially the way that our infrastructure works for every single one of our customers in a standardized, consistent manner is tied to a policy on ISO 27001 that we then map to things like HIPAA, the Canadian privacy regulations for healthcare, GDPR, and then industry expectations such as high trust and SOC 2. These policies are written in code effectively in YAML so that we can real-time audit them through things like software auditing processes, as well as our monitoring system. You're going to see our monitoring system later today, and then it proves that some of these policies are actually in place. So we've taken this same work, and I'm happy to announce this might be news for some of you. MedStack is going to win a high trust and SOC 2 certification in the next couple of months. The majority of the work is actually done, but we've done this in a way that nobody's ever done it before. So we've actually responded to all of the test requirements from the third-party auditor to win this certification, which is something that a lot of the healthcare enterprises are asking for from their cloud vendors. In other words, yourselves and us as an infrastructure provider behind them, in a manner that we can show the proof of these requirements in real time because of our code-generated policies. This is going to mean that our customers themselves, the application developers, will be able to win high trust and SOC 2 certification faster themselves. And we're going to extend this to third-party certification for ISO and GDPR next year. So that's what we do today, and that's also going to apply in exactly the same way for MedStack Control. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe, who's going to show you the product.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Paul, for the great intro. I have a tiny preamble of my own, and mostly sort of like what this means to your business, especially to your engineer teams. So there's going to be kind of a bit of something for everybody here in this talk, a bit of stuff for the business and a bit of stuff for engineers. Like, namely, the engineer part of it will include sort of how a migration would look like. What happens when you press the MedStack button? What does that look like? And of course, the demo, as we've mentioned. So when I get asked like what control is, I guess the most pithy and sort of engineer-friendly response I have is we're essentially a managed service for healthcare applications. So that means, for those not familiar with that term, that means basically it allows the business to kind of offload a lot of their compliance responsibilities to us in a very startup-friendly way. Like the startup playbook always suggests that you shouldn't focus too much outside your core competencies. So we sort of help take that part on in terms of easing those pain points for you guys. So that's essentially a nutshell of what we are. But there's more to it, I think, in terms of what this means is for getting onto MedStack. And namely, some of you may have heard this concept of infrastructure as code, shift left. Basically, what that pertains to is that there's always been sort of like a relative scarcity of DevOps security compliance people staffing wise. And so Paul talked about the empowerment and the word control as part of your MedStack Control. What that means specifically from an engineering perspective is that we empower your developers to be able to kind of manage their own infrastructure in a very self-sufficient way. There's a lot of automated controls for cluster monitoring, including intrusion prevention or detection, I should say. Other monitoring pieces, and all that I think in tandem will help your developers be very self-sufficient on MedStack Control, which is sort of one of our intents and goals with developing this in the first place. So what happens when you press the MedStack button, so to speak? We want to acquire as minimal change as possible to your team. So that means that it doesn't really matter what cloud you're on, we essentially just sort of augment what you have and map it over to our world. That's a bigger discussion, but we can definitely have that. Once everything is accounted for, basically all you do is just go to the dashboard, which I'm going to show you to set up your application. We can go over this division responsibilities slide, which basically just talks about how like you have your own space. You don't have to worry about circumventing the security controls that are in place. You basically have your own space for managing your applications, and we let you have at it. We don't block you from doing anything that your application needs to do. So I think Paul covered the security tab pretty well. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, but here's a list of what we cover. Anyway, without further ado, let me jump into the demo part of this. Okay, so what we're looking at is MedStack Control. But before I jump in, I think the sort of the media section is the control section itself. But before I jump into that, we have the activity section, which basically gives you sort of compliance-friendly listings of events that happen with the dashboard. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in these sections, but things like sections for inviting users. I've already pre-created the account because that takes a little bit of time. I've already kind of set up the cluster. We don't want to have to wait for VMs to be created. But essentially, all this is done. You can invite users. You can reset your password, do all sorts of things. The monitoring section I'll show you in great detail. I think it'll make more sense after we finish the demo. But like I said, the meat and potatoes of this is in the control section itself, which is what you're looking at. And from here, we can basically create different clusters that sort of represent physical environments you may have, like a staging, a UAT, production, what have you. And these provide isolated environments for setting up your application. There's no direct communication between the clusters, so there is a complete isolation. If I click on new cluster, I can specify what region I want the cluster to be in, give it a name. And finally, once like I said, I've pre-created this cluster just to kind of expedite this demo. Once I have a cluster, I can create different nodes in the cluster. And what this allows is to basically scale your cluster to whatever your capacity is for dealing with your traffic. So when you click on new node, there's a variety of options, a variety of instance types you can choose from. You can have as many of these as you want as necessary for your platform. And there's also an option, a feature we call placement constraints that allows you to basically create a label and assign a service, meaning a part of your architecture directly, pin it directly to that VM. And what that gives you is if you have a component of your environment that requires a little more horsepower, a little more resources than other components, you can set up that pinning to ensure there's not going to be a competition of resources and isolation for those kind of more thirsty parts of your architecture. So anyway, once I've created my nodes, I have a complete cluster. In this case, there's 2 nodes in my cluster. The swarm manager, sort of the traffic cop. We'll go into that in a little more detail later. But essentially, when I step into the cluster and click on this arrow, I will see the configuration for the cluster. And right now, I've intentionally left it kind of naked. There's nothing running in the cluster. But I will go over these tabs very quickly. I think these are sort of foundational pieces to understanding how everything works. We have the registries section, which is where you define your private repo, where your Docker images are going to reside. In this case, we also set up the authentication for GitLab in advance. But if I were to want to create a new one, I just click on Add Registry, and the username and password fields are here. I can use Docker Hub, GitLab, or pretty much any other private repo, but we've done a lot of testing on Hub and GitLab in particular. When I click on secrets, I can create basically key value pairs that your application may need, particularly things like database credentials and keys and certificates and sensitive pieces of information that drive your platform. A secret is a little different than an environment variable because when you create it, it's completely encrypted, and it's write only. So I can't actually see the value of the secret from within the GUI. So in other words, if you go to your service and update it, you're not going to. If someone happens to be looking over your shoulder, they're not going to see your database password. But this gives you a complete encrypted way of managing your sensitive bits of information. Your data can be a single line of text. It can be multiple lines. We don't really care what you put in your, as your data can be, like I said, certificates, a key, what have you. These are available as files that can be mounted onto your container. So your application would simply read from these individual files and access the data that way, and you're off to the races. The configs are the exact same thing, except without the encryption. So a use case for this might be like, say, a set of application settings, configurations for your application. Here's an example, for example, just a simple JSON object. And finally, volumes is where if you have some data that it should be persistent, meaning when you delete your service, update your service, what have you, the data should not be sort of obliterated with it. So this allows you to basically tie a volume directly to a cluster node. So it's persistent. It's not going to die along with the service. Finally, now that we've had sort of that preamble out of the way, we can finally go ahead and create the application. And this application is basically a basic hello world kind of application. It's a guestbook application. It's super, super simple. You simply define, you simply write a piece of data, you click save, it saves it to the database. It's not too much to it. But to stand up that application, I click a new service. The first piece that we're going to add is 3 components to this application. First piece is the load balancer, which basically exposes the application to the internet. It allows you to specify a domain or a subdomain you want to map to an individual service, along with the port that it should listen on. We also handle all of the certificates. You don't have to worry about purchasing a certificate, renewing an SSL certificate, which is a little bit of a pain in the butt if you're an engineer. We handle that for you by automatically requesting that certificate from Let's Encrypt and handling the renewals. And actually, when you go to monitoring, the monitoring section, you can see the history of that cert, including its renewals. There's probably nothing there now because we sort of use this cluster a lot for demos and stuff. So there's not a whole lot of that, but you would see that if you had a cert that was long enough to be renewed. Anyway, so the load balancer is literally just a one-click install. We don't pre-install it because we don't assume that everyone's going to want to expose their cluster to the internet directly, at least not immediately. But there's no configuration for it. I just click on create, and it's created just like that. And my next step of this application, like I said, there's 3 services. The second service is my database. So in this case, what we've set up for this demo is Postgres SQL. And the image URL is just referencing the public Docker Hub image, as well as version 9.6. But if as you'll see in a minute, if I want to specify the full URL to a private repo, I can just as easily do that. But there's no real kind of MedStack, sort of weird proprietary layer that your engineers will have to learn or reconcile with. It's very directly aligned to Docker itself, Docker Compose, Docker Swarm, the whole family of Docker products. Meaning that if you were to go to Docker Hub and sort of look at the documentation for this image, you'll find that there's a lot of options for the image, and particularly around environment variables, things like adding like default admin password and username and stuff like that. We'll honor all of those, so you can use this image the same way you would locally, really. If you're familiar with setting up Docker Compose, it's the same thing. It's really just the same thing. All this directly aligns with your Docker Compose configuration. In this particular case, I'm just going to go with it as it stands and create it as it is, just to keep things simple for this demo. And I'm going to click create. And I have a confirmation screen, not much to see or do here. It's going to click save. And there we go. The database is being placed into the cluster. As you can see, it's transitioning and it's ready to go now. If I wanted to, maybe asking like, how would I run a custom query or sort of do some database maintenance kind of stuff? If I wanted to, I could issue a psql command directly here, or even just start a shell. And by doing so, I'm dropped into a terminal. I can run all my usual psql commands, do database dumps, whatever you want to do, run a custom function. Myriad of things you can do just by having direct access to a terminal, like as you can see here. And I can also bring up logs for the database. You can see the usual container logs that are output when the container starts. And yeah, it's pretty basic. You'll see this again when we set up the next service, which is the final piece of the puzzle, which is the actual application code. And again, I'm going to go to custom service and add new. And this particular demo happens to be written in Python. Flask particular as a framework. And I'm going to, this time I'm going to use our GitLab repo. And I'm going to pull the image from our repo. And this time I'm going to set the replica number to 2, meaning copies of the container running. This allows us to kind of increase the capacity that and the redundancy for that image. The load balancer piece is smart enough to know that if for some reason one of your replicas is unhealthy, it won't route traffic to it. So it's provides you a little resilience and capacity there. And I'm going to map a domain. I just created this domain for the purpose of this demo, webinar.quasgar.net. And the internal port that this listens on, I should say, is port 80. We'll automatically upgrade that to port 443, which is the SSL service port. You'll see that in a minute. And I'm going to do 2 more things. I'm going to specify that the DB host is PostgreSQL. And what this does, if you're wondering how do containers communicate with each other, which is pretty much a requirement for almost every environment, by using the service name as a host name or a DNS name, I can communicate directly with this container on a private encrypted network. So we have the ability to communicate to Postgres directly. And finally, the last piece, I'm going to say that my application is just going to quickly create this database for the application. So instead of using the default admin database, I'm going to create a new one for the application called testDB prod. So that's that. If I wanted to map a config, I was showing you the configs and secrets before. They're files, as I said. So if you want to map an individual config you specified to a file or a directory, you can do that here. Same thing with amount and the volume. It's just basically sort of a mapping. And finally, a placement constraint. If I want to tie this to a particular VM, I can do that here by setting a placement constraint using this syntax. I'm going to click create. And once again, my confirmation screen. And if the demo gods, so to speak, are on my side today, we should have, in a minute, the application should be running. And looks like we're on the right path. We have 2 replicas, and the check mark show that it's running, it's healthy. So with any luck, I should be able to go to the domain that we created before, access it, and presto, we're good. We have a running guestbook application. We're good to go. I can access service logs that show that the logs, the evidence that the Flask is running, this application is running. I can do the terminal commands, look at individual logs. Yeah, and finally, the monitoring section. Thank you. The monitoring section, if I wanted to sort of look at the status of my cluster, I can click on this, and in a second, it'll bring up some stats pertaining to the cluster health itself. So like the memory consumption. Don't be alarmed about the memory usage. It's high because we're using small instance types, and it's using the available memory to optimize its performance. The CPU is a little more relevant, and it's low as expected. You would see certificate history here as well as some other stats, in a cluster that's been running for a little longer. But that's essentially it. Yeah, I guess we can open up for questions now if there are any questions.
So we've got one question so far, double-parted question. So I'll start with the first part. The first question is there anything that stops an engineer from printing out secrets from within running containers?
Within running containers, if you wanted to open up a terminal and access the file directly from inside the container, you could do that. But the idea of the encryption is mostly sort of getting the secret into the container. The extra security there is to assure that, for one, prying eyes are sort of looking over your shoulder, you're not going to be able to see the value of that secret, but also as it gets directed to that container, it's fully encrypted. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Awesome. I'm just pulling up the chat now, so I'll be a little more aware of what's going through the chat.
Okay, so we have another question here. The question is, what value add does MedStack provide over creating services directly using AWS and Docker?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is Balaji speaking here, and I'm glad the question was characterized that way because I guess in some of the technical hiccups we had at the beginning of the session, we rushed through it. And a very important statement I wanted to make at the beginning was we have built MedStack Control, as you can tell, atop of Docker Swarm. So this whole system runs on a industry standard container orchestration framework, taking advantage of the existing Docker community, Docker processes that the developer community is rallying behind. What we have found, this actually is a question kind of more general on MedStack itself and not just specifically on control. What we've actually found is that in order to build all of the expectations of the healthcare industry from the perspective of privacy and security, and Joe showed a slide on this briefly earlier, things like encryption at rest and in transit, scheduled backups, audit logging, network security, secure tunneling, monitoring, certificate management, etc., that are specifically required by the privacy compliance expectations. All of this is specific configuration that's required on top of sort of bare bones AWS, for example. And we've seen companies require a dedicated department resource for this. And that's not even the hardest part. The hardest part is the work never really goes away. Because every time you change your application, you have to make sure all of that's in place, maintained, and unaltered, such that the commitments you've made to your downstream healthcare customer are in place and up to date. So what we've done is we've automated that entire process and locked it down so that it can't be changed. And we monitor it in real time to show that it's actually in place with our privacy policy. So what we're replacing is DevOps configuration work and legal work with the creation and implementation of the policies in response to two things. First of all, this being work that's outside the scope of a company who may be focused on machine learning technologies, on user experience, healthcare integration, et cetera. And secondly, in response to the healthcare industry telling us that in a lot of cases, this stuff isn't done in a consistent enough manner that they know they can trust it. And so that's kind of what we've specifically built our team and focus on. MedStack Control is adding a layer of user flexibility to this commitment without actually altering any of the commitments themselves. And so, you know, there is a little bit of a misnomer out there that says that if you choose a major public cloud provider and host your application on it because they are quote unquote HIPAA compliant, that makes you HIPAA compliant. That's not actually true. All it means is that the physical security aspects, such as disaster recovery, et cetera, are built in, but the operational data security and data privacy management aspects are not, and that's what actually has to be built. Typical spend on this is $100 grand a year. So, you know, that's the budget you would need to add if you want to build the resource to do this and maintain it in real time. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. The next question is, how do we migrate live production apps to control from the classic MedStack dashboard?
Sure. So first of all, you'll definitely be, as a current customer, you'll definitely be hearing some from support. We'll give you a lot of individualized attention as to how to make that jump. But from a high level, let me preface that by saying one thing I really appreciate as an engineer about control is that we're not sort of inventing a weird abstraction layer. Like I said before, we're using Docker. There's actually a Stack Overflow survey where Docker was ranked as the second most loved platform in the world, only behind Linux. So we're used to something that all engineers, hopefully, are not going to grumble too much about. You know, we're making that change very simple and minimal. But going back to your question as to concretely, like how do you make that jump? It sort of depends upon the specifics of your architecture, how to map everything over. And we'll definitely be in touch with you on an individual basis as to you know, how to do that and give you the care you need to make that transition. Does that sort of answer the question a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that as well. The history behind MedStack Control, we've been working on it for a number of months. We had a few customers and close partners of ours playing with it the early part of this year. We've now introduced a couple of our new customers and partners commercially onto the platform and have started a migration process as well. So that if you are a current MedStack customer, we're scheduling reach outs based on your existing architecture with us to plan a transition over to MedStack Control. This is going to be the future of MedStack. And so it introduces a lot more power and flexibility and consistency to our product offering. I should also add that it actually introduces another feature we haven't actually talked about yet, which is that it changes our billing model. So now, in response to what a lot of our customers have told us, with MedStack Control, we're actually only billing for what you actually use. In other words, what traffic actually goes through the system, allowing you to be flexible for the changing needs of your business, demos, et cetera. And so we've taken note on the question of where it came from, and actually we have that reach out scheduled very, very shortly. If you are using Docker already, just as a preview, that makes the transition much easier. If you're not, we have plans to help you guys with that process.
Oh, great, great. So we've got a couple of other questions here. First one is that there's concern about being able to test and learn the new system while still running the existing system.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so you can certainly set up your cluster, do all your testing in advance. There's even ways to, by setting up a temporary testing subdomain. There's probably some other approaches too that we can talk about offline, but there's ways you can certainly simulate receiving traffic to your cluster, make sure everything is good to go in that environment, and then plan to make the transition. There's things that are a lot more complicated as far as like making your data make the jump. That depends on where your data is hosted, of course, but we can talk about that offline too. It's very difficult to generalize these sort of things because everyone's architecture is a little bit different, has their own sort of quirks and characteristics to it.
If that question was if you're an existing MedStack customer on our existing system and you want to experiment with MedStack Control before making the transition, we're very happy to support that. Please reach out to us through support@medstack.co. We'll set up a demo for you. And again, because of the way that we've set up the commercials for MedStack Control, you can actually do that commitment free. And when you're ready to make the transition, we'll help you with it.
Yeah.
Great. And the last question here is around MedStack's involvement and liability. So specifically, what is MedStack's involvement and or liability in the event that a company gets audited by a compliance authority?
Yeah, great question. So, to take a step backwards and upwards in terms of the way that our relationship with our customers works and the promise that we're making, you can think of compliance in a few layers. And I'm talking about compliance because that's, specifically what you'll be audited for from the perspective of a healthcare enterprise that you might be selling into. So one level is the physical security, like are the actual physical disks themselves protected, being breached, et cetera. This is why we run MedStack and MedStack Control on major public cloud providers because they have those commitments in place. We incorporate those commitments. You can kind of think of us as a reseller in this relationship model. We incorporate those commitments and then add on it a layer of what we call operational security. So that is things like certificates and audit logs and backups, network security, et cetera. Because we implement and manage all of those things, your contract with us does include a liability clause. So we have cyber liability insurance. We have a liability clause and statement that we're setting up to, as well as a process that's set up for breach notification as well as investigation. And then, of course, there's your application itself. So if something malicious is happening at the application level above the infrastructure, say the application design itself is built in such a way that from the local environment, it's exposing data in a way that shouldn't, or things are happening inside your sort of organization at a people level, obviously that's outside of our scope. However, with our partners, we also supply consulting services and pre-written policies so that you can ensure you have all of those aspects covered as well. That's outside of our liability framework, of course, but we know that's something you need. We think of that as the kind of remaining 30% of what compliance is all about, the 70% being the infrastructure, which is what we cover.
Are there any more questions? We've got about 10 minutes left, if anyone has any more. Otherwise, we're happy to give you some time back in your day.
We're going to be doing this again, and as well as MedStack Control. Like the whole reason we built this product is because of the feedback of our customers and our community. If you know us, you know that we're a very community-focused organization. We're in the business of making you guys successful. We'd like to know what you would like to see. There are things in the roadmap backlog of MedStack Control that we've not shown you yet that we're building. We have a lot of things actually coming that we're really, really excited about. The first few customers have given us, Joe specifically, actually an incredible amount of feedback that we're building into the UX of the product, into product demos, documentation, even content on our website, etc. We're constantly taking this feedback. Please do not be shy. Please do not hesitate to be critical. All of this is extremely valuable to us. If you are an existing MedStack customer, please reach out, support@medstack.co as well. And Nat will provide some information on contacting us. Reach out to us on social. We'd love to know how we can help you be more successful with a product like this.
All right, looks like we do have a couple more questions here. So the first one is GDPR, PIPEDA, PIPA, those all focus on different areas. Will moving to MedStack make us compliant for all?
That's a great question. Yeah, so there's kind of an interesting backstory behind this. And as I said sort of in the beginning, MedStack as a company is based here in Canada. We started, myself and my partner Simon, we started with focusing on the US because in a lot of ways sort of US regulations, when compared to the rest of the world from the perspective of digital privacy, are not always the most stringent. But when it comes to healthcare, HIPAA is the most well-documented and stringent data privacy, digital data privacy regulation that's out there. So we started with that and ensured that MedStack could meet the regulations of HIPAA and then by extension, the high-tech amendment and high trust framework as well. And then in terms of geographic expansion, we would then compare that to predominant regulations, different jurisdictions. And in most cases, pretty much all the cases we've looked at so far, if you're compliant with HIPAA, you will meet the expectations of the region you're moving to, if that region even has a regulation. A lot of places, they're still building ones, and the ones they're building, they're mapping off of HIPAA. Obviously, there's going to be some places in the world where this is going to become a little more complicated. For example, recently we did an assessment on Australia. We found we can actually meet the requirements of Australia. We actually have MedStack deployed there now. But countries like Japan, for example, might be a little more challenging. That's going to require more study on our part. What we end up doing is our policy becomes a superset of the requirements of all of these regional frameworks. The only other requirement then is that in a lot of cases, either from a legal perspective or an industry expectation perspective, the data has to be hosted in country. What does that mean? It means MedStack is deployed on a data center in that country, in that region. So right now, MedStack is actually running in Canada, the US, Latin America, Western Europe, and Asia, and Australia as well, all with the same policy set. So the short answer to your question is, by and large, yes, but we'd be happy to discuss specific examples as well.
Okay, great. And one final question. Does MedStack have any plans to support Kubernetes?
Great question, and our expert is actually in the room. So I'll provide a very non-technical preamble, and Joe, I'd be happy for you to comment as well. Yeah, and pretty much anybody who's looking at the container world is going to be asking about Kubernetes. We made the decision to build MedStack on Docker Swarm for a very specific reason. And it was because the Kubernetes movement created container orchestration, which has completely changed the way that cloud deployments work. We looked at containers a few years ago and we realized it was too early at that time, because in order to use container orchestration, the early versions of Kubernetes required a tremendous amount of technical depth, which is what we found wasn't the case with a lot of our customers and the focus that they had in terms of where they wanted to spend their time. However, because of Kubernetes, container orchestration became very, very popular, and then Docker Swarm was created, building on the existing Docker community with an intention of simplicity. And that's why we built MedStack Control on top of Docker Swarm. However, that being said, we've actually just recently built a strategic relationship with Docker themselves. We have a bunch of intelligence from the Docker community, which we sort of alluded to earlier. Docker Swarm and Kubernetes are essentially going to be merging, building the best expectations of both. So support for a pre-existing Kubernetes repository is absolutely in our roadmap. Want anything, Joe?
Yeah, it's actually kind of a funny situation, speaking as an engineer, because like from the outside, it may kind of seem like there might be sort of an adversarial relationship between Google and Docker in this, but it's really not the case at all. Having gone to a number of conferences, Docker is just very warm and receptive and open to the fact that they're fully embracing Kubernetes. Kubernetes support is built right into Docker desktop itself. There's really no ambiguity that there's not going to be a sort of intentional monkey wrenches placed to make a switch difficult. It's a smooth transition in terms of that. And in terms of our world, in terms of MedStack, we see it as a layer that we can swap out. In fact, we've been sort of evaluating what that might look like and what changes might be required. And it's kind of early to give a concrete answer, but in many cases, it's likely that customers are going to have to change very little, if anything at all. So it'll be something we sort of slip in if we decide to go on that road when it's ready. And I think there will be some very indirect benefits to customers, but for the most part, customers are not going to be terribly aware of it, because to them, their world as it stands now is the MedStack dashboard, which is not going to change. They're going to log in and define a service the same way they do now. It's just under the hood, there's going to be a different orchestrator sort of taking that configuration and applying it to their cluster.
We would be happy to take your feedback in terms of the workflow and use case you're looking for if you're an existing Kubernetes user.
Yeah.
We have people on our team actively looking at this, and this is the right time to get that input.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. It looks like that's it for questions. So with that said, we will end the call. Thank you very much, everyone, for your patience, for your questions, and for joining us, most importantly. Once again, we will be making this recording available via email, so have a look out for that link. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and check out our website for more information on Control specifically. And of course, if you have any questions, if you need to get in touch, you can always email at us at info@medstack.co. Thank you very much again.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Hope you enjoyed it and find it useful, and we will hopefully hear from some of you soon.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.